All right, guys, this is an overview of a little essay I wrote called Race Doesn't Exist, Races Exist. So, we often have this debate, especially in nationalist circles, about the existence of race, usually with egalitarians, libertarians, Marxists, whoever, right? Um, and these debates are very unproductive, okay? Usually, what happens is that someone will see um, significance in race, right? For example, myself, and then they will hear race realist arguments, and then they will use that to justify their position and become race realists. Okay, so the people that become race realists, they're already thinking these things, whether that's because of the propaganda that we put out on poll or consume product or whatever, or just what they see in real life. Okay, and a lot of these people will harbor guilt and negative emotions until they get some sort of scientific justification for these sorts of beliefs. Um, Now that's really how this debate works. Is that the people that already feel a certain way, they use the data to just sort of reinforce their priors. Okay, it's not entirely about objectively um, understanding how the how reality works, or trying to be very objective um, and emotionally neutral about the topic of race. Okay, has nothing to do with that. And so that's sort of the first thing to understand. Second thing to understand is that nobody's actually defined the word exist. Okay, and you might say, "Oh, well, that's like a stupid libertarian argument," which is true. I mean, libertarians, stoners, like the kind of people that watch David Icke, they will make these kinds of arguments, and really, those kinds of arguments are used to muddy the waters, to confuse you, to keep you running around in circles, and just sort of um, pull the strings in the debate. Okay, and yeah, it's very manipulative, especially given the fact that these people can't define their terms either. They can't tell you what the word exist means. Okay. Um, and on either side, I don't really blame them because when you go to the dictionary, you pull up the definition of the word exist and you get a bunch of synonyms. And this is the same problem that you get with Aquinas, right? Or these other philosophers that have supposedly defined the word exist. I mean, Aquinas's definition is just like a very long and convoluted definition that's sort of broken up into different words. So, for example, in the definition of exist, he includes the word essence, and then you got to go to the word essence, and you end up finding more words he didn't define, and so it's all these people are doing is just synonyms. Okay, there's a lot of words in the dictionary that up until this point, up until very recently, we just couldn't define because we had no criteria um, for what a definition should be, or um, like where the buck stops, etc. Like you have words like time, figure, motion, location, point, all square, right? You can't define these words because you incessantly describe them. You incessantly introduce more words that need to be defined. They say that a square is a figure that, right? And then you go look up the word figure, and then you get uh, more synonyms. Okay, um, so I don't really blame you if you think that's a silly argument or it's a dishonest argument or whatever, because every time it's been used, it's just been stupid, silly. It's just a waste of time. Okay, but I come from the Gadian perspective. that is Bill Gaty, okay, and rational science. And we have definitions for all these words. Okay, we've defined the word time, we've defined the word motion, color, square. You know, we've we've answered all of those questions. Okay, what is time? What is an object? Okay, an object being a very important definition. Um, so let's begin with the definitions. Okay, because if you can't define your terms, um, you're just wasting your time. Okay, and the race debate is not even about whether race exists or doesn't exist. It's really about, are racial differences significant, which is a completely different question altogether. Okay, and they what these people do is they try to prove, for a particular set of assumptions, for particular measurements, right? They try to prove that this group has a certain IQ level, this other group has another IQ level, um, which is silly because proof and evidence are completely subjective, right? Um, just because, just because you predict something, that doesn't mean that that is objective, right? You're simply describing what will happen in the future. It's uh, it's not some sort of guarantee, right? Um, right. Like, just because a theory has been replicated, that doesn't mean that that thing actually exists, or that is the correct number of things, right? Because it's all based on saw and heard. Somebody saw something. Somebody heard something. Somebody says that they measured something correctly or whatever. And you can say that that's silly. If I take a coffee cup and I drop it on the ground, I predict that it will fall to the ground. Okay. Um, what is that? Not objective, right? Are we going to not say that that's what's going to happen? No. What you see in front of you, okay, that's still an assumption. That's still subjective. Okay, right? It's you could be imagining things. You could have uh, seen a mirage, whatever. Okay, and you could say that I'm being like really trivial when I say that, but trust me, people will throw this shit at you. Okay, they will throw this shit at you. They will say that I don't trust you. I think that you did something wrong, that you made a mistake, blah 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 blah. And so in science, we can only start from an assumption. Okay, we start from an assumption and then we explain something using that assumption. And this means that if you're going to debate someone on any particular topic, and you don't share the same set of assumptions that that person shares, you're wasting your time. Okay, it's a complete waste of time. You can't do science. All right, science meaning rational explanations, not meaning predicting something, not meaning telling us how fast it went, or or trying to get everyone to vote on your theory. Okay, that's not how this works. You take an object, you take a starting scene, right, and you explain something with that starting scene. So, for example, let's just say that a window broke. Okay, you have to explain what caused that window to break. What are the objects? What's the mechanism that caused that window to break? Okay, another example would be the atom. What keeps the so-called electron held to the so-called proton? If you can't um, show me, you can't draw, you can't put an object in there. Okay, your explanation is fundamentally irrational. Okay, it would be like saying, say your friend got to school very quickly. Okay, um, and let's say that the explanation is that your friend can walk through walls. How are you going to draw that, right? How are you going to draw your friend, walking through walls like a ghost? That's irrational. Um, so that's what science is. Science is rational explanations, and math, measurements, experiments, observation in the Gadian view is not a part of science. Okay, so we have to define our key terms, and that is just so that we can establish the setting scene, so that we know what we're talking about. We have the objects visible in our heads, right? And of course, we make sure to distinguish between objects and concepts. Concepts being the relation between two objects, and an object being that which has shape. Um, so yeah, so um, sorry, I'm getting a little bit lost. Um, yeah, significance. Significance, that's just a matter of opinion. Okay, these people, they go out and they measure things, they observe things, and then they tell us that they've been proven that that's what's really happening. And then they start their scene, and that's like, sure, that's okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with doing research or doing experiments. But when you're trying to argue with someone, okay, that's not objective, right? That's your those are your assumptions, okay, right? And it's not objective. So easiest way to answer this or the correct way to answer this topic is to start with the definition of the word exist. Now, the definition of the word exist is very easy. It's just physical presence, an object that has location, an object being that which has shape, and shape being the one word we cannot define. Okay, shape is the one word in the dictionary we cannot define. We can define or we can define what a tree is. We can define mass, information, time, all these words. But shape is what definitions allude to. Okay. So, for example, the word big, it's dependent on objects. It's dependent on two objects, a big object and a little object. Um, and of course, the objects themselves, like you just show those. Um, you don't describe those. Okay, because that's it's irrational. Okay, that's not how you tell us what a tree is, for example. So exist just means object plus location. So we have to establish whether race is an object and whether it has location. Now, as it turns out, the word race is very confusing because race is used as both an object and as a concept. So this means that in one sense, um, race exists, but in the other sense, it doesn't exist. And let me explain. Um, Concepts cannot exist. So, for example, the word intelligence. You can't pick up intelligence and put it on your table. You can't make furniture with it. Okay, it's a concept. It's the relation between two objects. Okay, so concepts do not exist because they cannot have location, and obviously they don't have shape. Now, objects can exist. Now, just because an object doesn't exist doesn't mean that it's not an object. So, for example, Bugs Bunny. This is an example that Gady uses. Bugs Bunny is an object, all right, because Bugs Bunny has shape. However, Bugs Bunny doesn't have location. You see what I'm saying? Um, it's kind of like God. If God wants to exist, God has to have shape and he has to have location. Okay, otherwise, you're talking about a concept, right? It's sort of like praying to intelligence, praying to time, praying to love, right? You don't pray to concepts, you pray to objects. Okay, and when someone's talking about God, a bunch of images, a bunch of objects flash in their head. Okay, they are thinking about objects, even if they reject so-called materialism, they are materialists. There's no such thing as a non-materialist. Okay, so you don't try to prove God's existence with some sort of experiment or something. Okay, you define your key terms, and if God meets that criteria, then God exists or doesn't exist. Now, the same thing with race. Okay, in one sense of the word, race exists. In another sense, it doesn't, because there's the concept race, as in I don't see race. Okay, that doesn't have shape. That's a concept. That's a relation, right? It's like color or um, important, right? Whereas a race, that's an object. That has shape. That is location. Just like the word beach. A beach has shape and it has location. Now, you can't um, you can't use words to perfectly describe a beach, okay? Because it's irrational to define an object, okay? And define, when I say define, I really mean to use words to uh, show, draw a picture of an object. You can only incessantly describe that thing, right? So, for example, um, with a square, you can only like you could talk about the angles. You could talk about the number of segments. You could talk about you could divide it up with lines endlessly, incessantly. Okay, because a line, remember, a line um, has an infinite number of locations within any 2 points. Okay, okay, and a point obviously is a location. So when you try to define what a line is, okay, and you talk about um, you can only put more and more points in there, right? Okay, you can only do that incessantly, right? And infinite just means incessant. So um, endlessly filling in a line with points. That's You're just describing it incessantly, okay? And that's not showing us the object, okay? We want to know what a square is, and to do that, you just point to the square. Okay, that's how a baby learns what a square is. Okay, and same with triangles, lines, colors, all that stuff. You just point. All right. So, or even concepts like big, right? You show a baby a little cup, and you show the baby a big cup. They understand what big means. Okay. Um. So yeah. So in one sense of the word, race exists, and in another sense, it doesn't exist. Okay. So both sides of the race realist, the racial debate are correct. Okay, in one sense, it's a social concept, construct, or a concept, and therefore doesn't exist. And in another sense, object, races are objects, and therefore they do exist because they have location and shape. Um, so yeah, so when you have this debate with people, just ask them to define their key terms and then provide your alternative. Okay, and as far as significance goes, whether there's a 15-point IQ difference or not, I mean that's just your assumption, and um, whether those differences are significant or not significant, that's just a personal preference. That's just your opinion. Okay, like it's like trying to establish whether or not a room is messy or organized. Okay, take a look at Tracy Emin's bed. Okay, is that messy or is that organized? Okay, it's put in the middle of a room to be presented. They put a little fence around it, right? And you can walk around the ropes and view it like purposely. It's put there in a purposeful way, but it's also, the sheets are we would say that they're messy, right? So it's just a matter of preference, personal opinion. So don't make those kinds of arguments. Anyone that argues about bell curves or anything like that, they're just arguing for their set of assumptions. And with assumptions, all you can do is try to convince and recruit people into those assumptions. Okay, that's all it means to prove something to someone. Truth just means that you're satisfied with your hypothesis. There's no such thing as you cannot actually know where things are. That's only nature can know that. Okay. And one one other thing I want to bring up is the continuum fallacy. The continuum fallacy, it's just the observation that it's hard to define things with a set of criteria. Okay, so a beach, for example, you can't like draw lines around where the beach ends and um, where the land begins, right? You can't do that. But pointing, you could point that out to an egalitarian. You could say, well, um, you say that race is insignificant because it bleeds in, but then you go to the quote unquote beach. How do you know that's a beach? That could be a mountain for all you know. You, the sand grains came from a mountain. How do you distinguish one from the other? So you can only point out their hypocrisy using that. You can't explain the topic, right? That doesn't actually explain anything. One other thing I want to talk about is taxonomy. Taxonomy has nothing to do with the existence of race. I wrote, geneticists would prefer the term subspecies. Their criteria is based on a measurement of the genetics of living things. But this is not how people understand race. It is just how scientists have decided to rationalize the distinctions that they already see. Lion to tiger is a bigger jump than brown bear to polar bear. And so they compartmentalize the distinctions based on the ability to interbreed or on a criteria of genetic distance. But obviously humans don't learn race this way. As I mean, it's not like the amount. It's not like the amount of genetic differences reach a certain number that suddenly they become a species. No, that's something that we distinguish with our eyes. Okay, and as far as like classifying them and trying to organize them neatly, that is something that humans do after the fact. That's just them um, trying to apply this very common view of definitions, all right, to objects that you got to describe it, right? You got to describe the objects, right? But you can't do that. I mean, just look at a tree, right? What is how are you going to say that this thing is not a twig and not a tree? I mean, that's you have to incessantly describe. Okay. In fact, you have to incessantly describe until you literally come up with um, the exact object, like bit by bit. And I don't even think you could do that. I think that's not even really possible. Um, so yeah, babies just sort of you just show them a black person, the baby understands the black person is instantly. Um, so what's the definition of race? I define it as the relation between two races. Okay, because then when you ask me what do you mean by a race, then I go switch over to the object definition and I just point. So a white person is this, and I point. Okay, so if you don't know what a white person is, just point to one. You don't know what the white race is, point to a bunch of white people, and they will understand. They will visualize the objects. Okay. Um. So there's that, and people want to bring up Aquinas. You know what? I've already talked about Aquinas. So I'll skip that. So my final notes. This is what I wrote in my final notes. I am personally in favor of the racialist worldview. Race is significant to me. It is something that I find very important as a nationalist partisan. But this doesn't mean that my position is objective or scientific. It is just my personal opinion. It aligns with my interests. Race denialism benefits the interests of urbanite bug people. Okay, and so that's why they'll say that race isn't significant to them. Well, they'll say that it's significant to other races, but I mean that's beside the point. Um, so that's pretty much it. Race doesn't exist, races exist. Okay, got that? All right, thank you.